Contemporary Liberalism, the Great Society, and After, Lecture 2. In the last lecture, I put the 1960s liberalism kind of in broader context of American progressivism and liberalism, and I talked about the three planks of the Great Society of the 1960s, those programs associated with LBJ, and those planks are material security, anti-discrimination, and quality of life. In this lecture, we move on to the Port Huron Statement, which was published by the student group Students for a Democratic Society in 1962. It was kind of their first manifesto, and it is a work which it's longer than what I gave you. I gave you just a few selections from it. I gave you mainly selections that come from a section called Values. But it has to do with their vision both of what's wrong with American society and how to fix it. And the 1960s are really the time of what came to be called the New Left, where there's a shift in character in left-wing politics in America and around the world. And the SDS was probably the preeminent student organization during that time. It was a left-wing student organization, broadly speaking. And in a general sense, the call, as is sort of in the name of the group, was for American society to become more democratic. And as I said, the Port Huron Statement was published in 1962. It was meant to be a statement of principles and goals. It's a manifesto. Its primary author was Tom Hayden, who had recently written a master's thesis on the sociologist C. Wright Mills. And if you know anything about C. Wright Mills, you will see the influence of Mills in the Port Huron Statement. Probably the philosopher with the greatest influence on Hayden, because he had the greatest influence on Mills, is John Dewey. And I was told by a professor of mine once upon a time, I haven't gone back to check everything, but that Dewey is actually the only philosopher that is explicitly referenced anywhere in the Port Huron Statement. So there's definitely a continuity between the Dewey reading and the Port Huron Statement. Now, I should note, though, the Port Huron Statement, it wasn't adopted by any political party, and the SDS, although an activist group, was not sort of directly influential in shaping U.S. policy. At most indirectly. And I include this Port Huron Statement because I think more than any other document of its era that I've come across, the Port Huron Statement kind of captures the spirit of young leftism in the 1960s, and especially the young leftism of the 1960s that was already taking shape before the protests against the Vietnam War came to consume so much of the time and energy and attention of the student movement. So, when people think of the 1960s and they think of activism in the 1960s, nowadays, especially younger people, tend to think primarily of, the civil rights movement and various offshoots of that, including, like the Black Panthers and things like that. So there's the civil rights movement, and they think of the anti-war movement. But there was kind of more to the left during the 1960s than just those two things. And I think the Port Huron Statement captures some of that. And also, so the Port Huron Statement, in one sense, it kind of shows what made the left of the 60s different from the left that came before, even if it's continuous with it. And also because, as we'll see in a subsequent lecture, some of the concerns about American society that are voiced in the Port Huron Statement make their way a few years later into some of LBJ's statements about the Great Society. So even if the SDS was not directly influential, it captures in a way a certain climate of thought among liberals and progressives in the 1960s about this question of where do we go from here? We've had the New Deal. Where do we go from here? And so just to kind of put this in a little bit more context, talking about the New Left, obviously, if you're going to talk about the New Left, this implies the existence of an Old Left. And so I want to say something about the Old Left and the New Left. Now, when the Old Left that is being invoked by contrast, when people talk about the New Left, is really the New Deal coalition. It's the coalition of interest groups and the Democratic Party and other groups within society around the New Deal platform. Liberals and socialists in favor of implementing an economic bill of rights, especially concerned with economic justice, very much concerned with issues of class, issues of poverty, issues of redistribution. So again, that material welfare and material security, the key plank of the New Deal, that's really what the old left was built around. But there's another element of the old left that is an inheritance of progressivism that the new left responds to. And this is that the old left also tends to be fairly technocratic. Now, you've probably heard that word before, technocratic, or sort of technocracy or whatever. And so to be technocratic or to be a technocrat, right, this involves the idea that there are many sort of problems and needs within society that are best addressed not through democratic, participatory, or political means, but that are really better addressed by experts who use their expertise to shape policy on behalf of the common good of society. So, when you think of technocrats, you think of something like, the Federal Reserve and the various bodies that regulate economic activity. And the idea here is, the economy is very complex. The problems involved with poverty, unemployment, things like that, these are very complex problems. So really what you need is special university-trained experts who can finely craft policy aimed at addressing these complex problems. And the thinking was, these are not the kinds of things that ordinary politicians or ordinary citizens are capable of doing. You need a good expert bureaucracy. So it's not all about participation. It's not all about consent. Some things are best left to the experts. Remember the progressive distinction between politics and administration. It's that kind of idea. The progressive movement was very, very much in favor of building up the bureaucratic aspects of the federal government, informed by various forms of expertise in order to achieve goods for society, but without necessarily having the input of society. Beyond just the general idea, okay, the American people want full employment. Fine. They don't want anybody to be out of work. Fine. But your average American citizen and your average American politician has no idea how to do that. It's much too complex. Managing the economy is way too complex to leave to a bunch of amateurs. So the American people have spoken. They want full employment. Fine, that's politics. Politics gives you the end. Now hand it over to the experts so that they can devise the best means to achieve that end. And so this corresponds, this leads to, in the course of the 20th century, a big building up in the federal bureaucracy. This is also a time when the kind of internal bureaucracies within major corporations grow. This is when the universities are growing. And so a lot of the public universities become very large bureaucracies. So in the course of the 20th century, you have this rise of bureaucracy in the public sector and in the private sector. And by and large, this was something that was supported by the old left, in the belief that that's how you get things done. There are things that require expertise, right? And you should leave that out of the political process. So the old left is concerned with material welfare. The old left tends to be fairly technocratic when it comes to how to address social problems. And then, of course, the other thing that enters in here after World War II is the Cold War, the conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. A conflict over interest, conflict over allies, right? It was called the Cold War because it never became overt war, although there were lots of proxy wars all over the world. And the old left was very much anti-Soviet in the Cold War. The leaders of the labor union leaders and the political leaders of the old left were quite vociferously anti-communist. And that's just that became another part of New Deal and liberalism. Now, the New Left differed along these dimensions. Remember, material welfare, technocratic government, and the Cold War. Obviously, the New Left, these were much younger. These are, kind of the almost the original baby boomers. I mean, really, the first generation that could be called New Left were probably born in the mid to late 30s. But, in the SDS, Port Huron Statement published 1962. So a lot of the people involved in the SDS in 1962 were people that were born right before the United States entered World War II. So you're right on the cusp of, the baby boomers. So they're younger. A lot of the people in the New Left, they don't come up through labor unions and things like that the way a lot of the Old Left did. They're really university educated. If the Old Left was formed kind of in the crucible of the Great Depression, it was really the crisis of the Great Depression that sort of set the agenda in a lot of ways for the Old Left and its class concerns. Really, the catalyst for the New Left was the civil rights movement in the South in the 1950s. And a lot of early leaders within the New Left began their lives of political engagement in the civil rights movement. If they're from the North, they went down to the South to try to help register voters and things like that. So what the Depression was to the New Deal left, the civil rights movement really is to the New Left. And of course, the civil rights movement, obviously a concern with poverty very much was there, but there was also this broader concern about discrimination and inequality of status within society, and how there are these marginal populations that are excluded from the decisions that are made that affect their lives. And so the civil rights movement had a major effect on the early New Left activists, and then a lot of them then brought their experiences with the civil rights movement back with them to college or university, oftentimes in the North, where some of the techniques and the ways of thinking about political organization that they had gained in the South, they then applied to campaigning for things such as free speech on campus and other social concerns. So the civil rights movement's very important for the New Left. So it goes beyond material welfare. Remember, the second plank was technocratic government. The Old Left was okay with technocrats. The New Left was very, very suspicious of bureaucracy of any kind, whether it was governmental bureaucracy or the corporate bureaucracy or labor unions or the bureaucracies running the universities. In all cases, they saw bureaucracies as kind of rule-bound, somewhat inhuman, stifling forms of social organization that sapped people's energy, sapped people's creativity, and sort of molded them and manipulated them into following social roles. So the New Left was very anti-bureaucratic. And then they actually were, when it comes to the third plank of the Old Left, the Cold War, the New Left was actually quite critical of the U.S. role in the Cold War. They weren't overtly pro-communist, but they weren't willing to be vociferous anti-communists either. They're kind of anti-communists. And so in that sense, they also became very sympathetic to a lot of the revolutions and independence movements in the Third World, many of which at least took on a kind of socialistic or communist cast. So the New Left was not pro-communist, but not anti-communist either. It was anti-communist. Now, I should mention that within a few years after this, by the late 60s, the SDS had become completely engulfed in the anti-war movement and had been radicalized, became largely Marxist and splintered and kind of went off the rails. So the SDS changes character quite a bit by the end of the 1960s. So that's what I have to say about the Old Left and the New Left. Now to the Port Huron Statement itself. So the authors at the beginning of the Port Huron Statement paint a kind of portrait of a powerful and prosperous, yet complacent American society at the dawn of the 1960s, and one with underlying paradoxes and problems that need to be addressed. So the idea of the U.S. stands for peace, and yet it has a massive nuclear arsenal. The U.S. stands for freedom and equality, and yet racial discrimination denies freedom and equality to African Americans, right? So this kind of sense that we're powerful and complacent and seemingly just, but with problems under the surface. And yet at the same time, there's this kind of public sense that the age of utopias, the age of ideology is over, that we're beyond that. We're beyond those romantic revolutionary times. Now it's really just about kind of managing society to make it prosperous. And so there's a public sense, they argue, that there's really no alternative to the present order of things, that things are basically good enough. And even underneath that, they argue that there's a kind of sense of apathy, futility, and even anxiety among within America, a lot of people in America, that despite the outward peace and outward prosperity and outward opportunity of the society, that there's something fundamentally lacking in the human quality of American society. Now, in pop culture, this gets sucked up into a kind of critique of the 50s. It's really superficial. But you can see how some of these issues, some of these problems with the kind of the post-war America of the 1950s are already being addressed in the 50s, and like the beat movement and certain things like that. So it's a broad cultural theme. And yet they also, the SDS, they note that at least for some, there still is, especially among some of the young, a real yearning to construct a more just society and to find more satisfying and more authentic ways of living, right? So there's a lot of talk about emptiness and anxiety amidst prosperity and the need for some kind of authentic alternative. And I'll note that this invocation of authenticity is really part of the philosophic debt that the New Left owes to the existentialist movement associated with Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir and Albert Camus, which gets started in Europe. This kind of idea that we live in a universe that doesn't give us answers to how we should live. There is no natural law, that really human beings are forced to make their own meaning. And so one of the most important things to do in your life is to kind of resolutely and with personal responsibility discern for yourself what you believe would be the most authentic way for you to live, the way that's really kind of true to yourself, instead of conforming to the expectations of your peer group or conforming to the expectations of the broader society and their status markers. So there's this really real concern that kind of freedom and a good life requires personal authenticity. And the search, as they say, for truly democratic alternatives to the present. And as they say, the search for truly democratic alternatives to the present and a commitment to social experimentation with them is a worthy and fulfilling human enterprise, one which moves us and we hope others today. That's on page 213 in the packet. Notice that invocation of social experimentation. That's that kind of Deweyan, that John Dewey aspect of progressive thought, that we need to kind of innovate with public policy, try things out, guided by good data, then see how they work out and kind of be willing to alter things as we go along. So then they move on to a kind of broader statement of principles that are meant to guide social change. Principles about human personhood, so their belief about what human beings are, principles concerning social relations, and principles concerning social systems or institutions. So the human person, human sociality, social institutions. And they have just some basic statements of principle at how we think these things should be guided. Now, the conception of human beings that they talk about comes on pages 213 through 214. So what's the vision of human nature that they adhere to? As they say on page 213, we regard man as infinitely precious and possessed of unfulfilled capacities for reason, freedom, and love. Notice unfulfilled capacities, that human beings are capable of being more reasonable, freer, and more loving or more charitable than current social institutions make them. And so they, as they go on to say, they specifically oppose any notion of human beings which treats human beings as things to be manipulated, right? Whether you're talking about management techniques, propaganda, human resources, strategies, or whatever, this kind of idea that the broad range of society is there to be manipulated by technocrats or by, Madison Avenue advertisers. That was also a concern, manipulation by consumer society. So they say human beings are not things to be manipulated, and they also oppose the notion that human beings are generally not capable of running their own affairs, but should depend upon the experts. So in other words, this idea, this kind of idea that lots of things are best left to the experts. And their argument is no, human beings are much more capable of running their own affairs than the current system gives them credit for. So instead, they insist on human agency, on the notion that ordinary people are capable of working together to govern their affairs in common. And this sounds in some ways like Tocqueville, but also like Dewey. Remember, because Dewey, although not in what I assigned you, but Dewey is also very emphatic about the necessarily participatory character of a good society, where people are maximally involved in making the decisions that affect their lives. And it runs against the technocratic side of the older liberalism that you find in earlier progressivism. And as I note, the New Left was distrustful of bureaucracy and government in corporations and universities and anywhere else they found it. They wanted what they call participatory democracy, where ordinary people have much more influence, but through deliberating collectively about over the institutions that they live under. So let me read to you also a paragraph on page 214, and you'll see here the connection with Dewey's notion of cultural freedom in this. So this is the first full paragraph. They say, men have unrealized potential for self-cultivation, self-direction, self-understanding, and creativity. It is this potential that we regard as crucial and to which we appeal, not to the human potentiality for violence, unreason, and submission to authority. The goal of man and society should be human independence, a concern not with image of popularity, but with finding a meaning in life that is personally authentic, a quality of mind not compulsively driven by a sense of powerlessness, nor one which unthinkingly adopts status values, nor one which represses all threats to its habits, but one which has full, spontaneous access to present and past experiences, one which easily unites the fragmented parts of personal history, one which openly faces problems which are troubling and unresolved, one with an intuitive awareness of possibilities, an active sense of curiosity, an ability and willingness to learn. End of quotation. And that's, a pretty good 1960s translation of what John Dewey meant in the 1930s by cultural freedom. The freedom to cultivate oneself through the widest possible access to all the resources that society can make available to them, coupled with a form of education that makes people able to critically and creatively engage with all of those resources and make up their own minds about things. And you can especially see in that paragraph how the concerns with the New Left go beyond concerns with material distribution of goods and reach into higher level concerns about self-actualization, so to speak, about the cultivation of virtues, although that's not the word they would use, such as honesty, generosity, authentic living, and so forth. Then they move on from there to talk about their conception of human relationships. And in that section, this is on page 214, they lament the kind of perceived pervasiveness of selfishness and egoism and materialism in American society, and the way that so many people are lonely and isolated from one another and alienated from their communities. There's something kind of like Tocquevillian individualism. And obviously this kind of critique with, middle-class bourgeois existence in the 1950s is part of our cultural DNA at this point. I think it's oftentimes quite superficial, but everybody's kind of familiar, I think, with these sorts of critiques of conformism and consumerism and the like, and the way that it actually leads people to live sort of empty lives. So what's interesting in this section is that the SDS, and this is one of, I think, the permanent tensions of the New Left, is they seem to be calling for the combination of two seemingly contradictory things. They want people to be both more individuals, more authentically individual, cultivate their personal individuality, what makes them uniquely themselves. And at the same time, they want people to be more deeply and personally enmeshed within communities. So they want more individualism and they want more solidarity. And usually the philosophic way, when it was ever really addressed, the philosophic way that they would bring these two things together was through some kind of claim that somehow when we are more true to ourselves, we become better neighbors to others. That when we're more true to ourselves as individuals, we become better members of communities at the same time. And that is an empirical thesis that I think at best has very mixed data to support it. But at any rate, that's the impulse here. In some ways, it's a weird kind of appropriation of some themes from the thought of Rousseau. But so they seem to be calling, on the one hand, for people to be truly independent individuals. And by that, they mean people where they don't determine their identities and their ways of life by conforming to what is popular or what is expected, but rather they try to determine for themselves who they want to be, what values they should have, and so forth. But then on the other hand, they also call for deeper community, right? Not just commercial relations and relations of employer and employee and stuff like that, but a deeper community where people live with a spirit of generosity and brotherhood towards others. As they say, we would replace power and personal uniqueness rooted in possession, privilege, or circumstance by power and uniqueness rooted in love, reflectiveness, reason, and creativity. That's a very tall order. You can see why they were quite open in saying that their aspirations were somewhat utopian in character, although they also thought that they could still be achieved. There's an interesting slogan that developed actually in the French left in 1968. The slogan was, "Be reasonable, demand the impossible." This kind of idea that which translated, that's sort of a funny a situationist provocation, but beyond that is this kind of notion that in part we have an overly narrow sense of what's possible because we have internalized the particular values and priorities of our society. And many things that seem wildly utopian might actually be realizable if people would simply shift the way that they think about human life. That's a way in which the left is very different from Marx. Marx, for example, in Marxism would never say something like that. But at any rate, we now get to the last part of the selections that I gave you about the Port Huron statement, which are the principles regarding social institutions and how to make them more democratic. Right? So having laid out their vision of individual independence and social solidarity, they turn to the topic of social systems and how to make institutions more democratic for people. And so they lay out these principles of what they call the democracy of individual participation. That is where people cultivate their individuality, and then as a society, they shape society through common deliberation with others. And these two principles are, one, that everybody should have a share in the decisions that affect people's lives. So that calls for the democratization of politics, the political parties, but also the democratization of universities. It's no coincidence that teacher evaluations filled out by students, it was kind of a new left thing that was introduced into the universities in the 1960s. This idea that students should have more say over the character of their own education. That's more participatory education. But it also calls for the democratization of businesses and things, that there should be more democratic control over the economic life of the country. So one of their principles is that individuals should have a share in the decisions that affect one's life. So far as I know, the New Left invocation of that principle, I've never seen them really address the problem of what Madison calls majority faction. The fact that in opening up more things to majority vote, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be making things more just if there are persistent minorities that are outvoted, but leave that aside. The second principle is that society should be organized in such a way as to encourage independence and also avenues for common participation. So in the realm of politics, it's discussed on page 215, this means more participatory public decision-making, so less technocracy, more democracy, more participation. And this is presented not only as something that will lead to better outcomes, but also political participation is presented as an important part of a meaningful human life and a positive means of constructing a good common life. Right? So it's not simply about solving problems, but political activity is actually part of human sociality, human togetherness. And so self-government becomes a part of a meaningful life. One of the things, and I'm not an expert in this area, but one of the interesting tensions in the Port Huron statement is that at the same time that they call for more participation, they also call for the nationalization of more areas of policy. So more like federal control over the economy, more federal control over the university. So there's this weird, I think Tocqueville would raise an eyebrow and say, if you want participation, you have to make things more local. This call to have both more federal policy and more participation, those two things can't really be put together very well. The more things you federalize, the more things are actually in the hands of the elite. But leave that aside. So politics should be organized so that people are able to discover how their own private and personal struggles and problems can be formulated into general public issues that can then be acted upon. right? So that's the vision of politics: more democracy, more participation, more opportunities for ordinary people to discover through common deliberation how their own personal problems are actually part of broader social problems, and then they can work together to try to find ways to solve those social problems together. In the economic realm, they have a very high view of work. This idea that work is not just necessary labor for money or for self-preservation, but that our working lives should be educative, creative, self-directed, and things like that. Work should be personally meaningful, personally directed. If anything, I think that's even more utopian than the political vision, because they're really calling for a fundamental transformation of work where you get rid of drudgery, which is something that Marxists, for example, would say is really only possible, after capitalism has been overcome. But also they argue that work should be democratized so that people have a say in the organizations that govern their economic lives. It's too important a part of life, they say, not to be democratized. So, this is something like, really not that far away from something like democratic socialism is what they're calling for. The major productive resources of society should be open to participatory democracy and democratic social regulation, they say. So that is something like democratic socialism. Then they make a broader statement about all institutions. Major social institutions, cultural, educational, rehabilitative, and others, should be generally organized with the well-being and dignity of man as the essential measure of success. So again, as with Dewey and others, all social institutions are potentially on the table. We need to democratize the schools. We need to democratize the factories. We need to democratize families. Right? We need to democratize our political institutions. We need to democratize our religious institutions, right? I mean, Vatican II was around the same time, is going on at the same time. So broader democratization combined with, as they note on page 215 through 216, a commitment to nonviolence, which is really something that came out of the participation in the struggle for civil rights in the South, principled nonviolence. Then in the final couple pages, they talk about various anti-poverty policies, better housing, healthcare, material security, education. That'll all come up in the Great Society. They talk about the need to fix urban problems, to reform the cities, which have become crowded, sometimes dilapidated. They basically say that cities need to be reformed to be made more livable. Again, they call for a kind of national policy here and a design for what they call model cities. And if you look at their description of a model city, again, it goes beyond thinking of the city as an economic unit to thinking about the city as a place where people as communities have kind of like meaningful participation with one another. They can partake of public spaces, natural beauty, right? So it goes beyond the kind of typical concern just with safety and economic productivity. And then in the last couple pages, they talk about the place of the university and why the university is really kind of the proper institutional home for the New Left. The idea being that, much more so than labor unions or political parties, that universities are the natural home for the kind of radical social critique, critical, deliberative thinking about policy that they are calling for the New Left. And also the universities are made up of younger people who are more willing to contemplate major changes. Universities are a much safer space for liberals and socialists to have exchanges than are the political parties, because of course at this time the Cold War socialism was nearly dead in the United States. And universities are, or they should be, they say, home to controversy. So really the proper institutional home for the New Left is not the political party, and it's not the labor union, it's the university. That's where the critical thinking, the deliberation, and the policy ideas they thought, and the activism would come from. So that's what I have to say about the Port Huron Statement. In the next couple lectures, I'll talk about the way that some of these issues and others get molded into these Great Society programs championed by Lyndon Johnson in the mid-1960s.